Welcome to another edition of the Grapevine, brought to you by Herdify. This week we are breaking the mould ever so slightly, and we're not going to have a guest because we've got something really exciting to talk about, and that is Performance Marketing World Unlocked that has just taken place this week as we record. And we thought, as opposed to just our normal format where we get guests on, and we've got a great backlog of guests coming, so don't worry about that. We thought it would be really good and timely to unpack some of the key questions and the key observations, and as usual, apply a bit of a sort of behavioural science analysis and a behavioural science lens to it to really help you drive your businesses forward. So without further ado, we're going to crack on with that. As usual, though, not to disappoint, I am, of course, joined by Ed. Ed, how are you?
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I'm all good, thank you. Just back from the XL in London, from Performance Marketing World Unlocked. So kind of ready to talk about it and try and remember what was 2 busy days.
Well, I think that's the really interesting thing today is I actually wasn't there. So my view of PMW, as I'm now going to call it, was very much WhatsApp driven and Teams driven between you and Vicky, who were there, and subsequent notes. So I think it'd be great to dive in. I think a great place to probably start really is there was a lot of content from 2 days from what I could make out. If you kind of had to take away, if you had to distill that down to your top 3 takeaways, let's do that, and then from there we can sort of dive into each one a bit further, and then at the end we can try and pull that together with some sort of takeaways that in the next sort of 20-25 minutes that people can walk away and hopefully take some stuff back into their businesses to make their marketing perform better. So top 3 takeaways, go.
So there was a lot to cover, or there was a lot covered. I think to set the scene for anyone that hasn't heard about Performance Marketing World Unlocked, so it's a performance marketing conference which was attended by brands of all sizes. There were very big brands like HSBC were there, Vitality, and also much smaller kind of e-commerce brands as well. And I think going in, there was a huge amount being talked about, lots of different streams, and a lot of it was targeted at very different markets as well. So, some of it was very much targeted at big corporate businesses and how they can, use performance marketing to support their brand, which everyone already knows about. Well, at the other end of the scale, some of it was about how you can use performance marketing when you're a startup, to break out and kind of break out your brand and start getting that brand recognition starting from zero, right? And what was really interesting that there were a few themes that really ran across that whole marketplace and kept going up time and time again. And those themes were, if I was to narrow it down to 3, cookies to a certain extent.
Nice.
They were less being spoken about by name now that they're nearly out the door, but it was definitely noted that they are still hanging in there. Yeah. And more, it was the conversation of, okay, post cookies, what are people doing?
Yeah.
How are people managing their data? And how are people trying to get the most out of what they're left with now? So I think we've got past the point where people are still trying to hang on to cookies or to a certain extent recreate cookies. And now it's, okay, how can we do the most we can with the data we have?
Interesting. Okay.
And what's interesting there, and we'll go into this later, is that really it speaks to this sort of, it depends on where you are in your journey and what size you are. Like, someone like a really big bank can do very different things with its data than the average e-commerce business. So for our listeners, it's important for them to kind of understand where they sit in that scale, say, of size, and therefore where the benefits are for them. The second thing which came up time and time again was attribution and measurement. So It's related to cookies in the sense that without cookies, it's become a lot harder. But more than that, I think performance marketers are sort of becoming a bit more suspicious of attribution within platform attribution. And in particular, when it comes to measuring cross-platform performance is becoming really hard. It is something people are really facing up to, especially as the number of platforms is growing. You know, when we're talking about performance marketing, yeah, we're talking about Google and Meta, but now we're also talking about TikTok and potentially things in the future like behavioural, you know, social networks that haven't even started having advertising on them yet. And also combined with that, those platforms are offering a whole bunch more places to place your adverts or ways to interact through adverts. So, you know, I know stores have just been shut on Instagram, but Instagram did have stores. TikTok has stores, right? You can put your product directly in there. And so understanding which performance metrics are important for each of those, and also for each of those positions, is something that people, I think, were really struggling with. And then it's okay comparing two different Instagram sponsored post campaigns, but how do you compare an influencer campaign to a sponsored post campaign? That sort of question of attribution and measurement came up time and time again. And I think related to that is the third thing that came up repeatedly, and that was the increased amount of the interest in brand effects of online marketing, and even using online marketing as a brand marketing channel. So thinking outside a lot of businesses kind of historically have thought about performance marketing and search, say in particular, as a way of generating sales today.
Mm-hmm.
When now people are starting to think, okay, actually, what is this doing for our brand? What does it do in terms of long-term sales?
Nice.
And how can we, as a result, and this relates back to the measurement piece, as a result, how can we measure its performance if we're now looking at different objectives?
Yeah, it's interesting, that last one, and will be interesting to pull this apart when we dive into it. But it comes back to this phrase that I hear kicked about the internet quite a lot, that there's no such thing as digital marketing, it's just marketing. You know, marketing is marketing, and digital is just part of that. So it shouldn't be
just where people are now.
Yeah, you know, just because digital is seen as, you know, end of the funnel quite often and where to get the sales, maybe it's not the right way to look at it. And I say, we're seeing more customers from our side as well, you know, from the Herdify side of things, who are contemplating that type of thing as well. So yeah, it's an interesting trend. Okay, so cookies, I love that, because I think probably one of the first things we started talking about in this podcast was cookies. So it's great that that's still part of the conversation all these years later, all these months later. Attribution and sort of more focus on brand in that sort of typical performance online world. So three areas, and you know, we spend a few minutes sort of pulling apart each one. I think what the question that dropped into my head when you sort of said cookies was around this different work the different things that are possible within, depending on what your scale is. You know, if you're a big company versus a small company, so it'd be great to pull apart some solutions in there. But first, I guess, thought in my head is, does this now put more onus on the companies to be able to work with data more? So does it potentially put, you know, smaller businesses that don't have those skills at a disadvantage, do you think?
I think the undoubted answer is yes, unfortunately. That, you know, bigger companies have bigger budgets, they can afford more complex solutions. But at the same time, smaller companies can be more agile with them. And I think that's the sort of the trade-off that exists. And also, I think it's important to think and to kind of understand that as a smaller company, it's just the way that sort of the business ecosystem works, right? Smaller companies are rarely at the cutting edge of things that are not within their product. And so there's still advantages to be had for smaller companies. And I think when we look at the solutions that are on offer, then sort of understand, you can see how they all sort of mimic, most of the solutions really mimic like similar ideas. And it's really about implementation, and then it's almost like what possibilities does that solution open up, right? So I think the problem of cookies disappearing has kind of reduced almost completely reduced the use of third-party data in a cookie, like third-party cookies, right? No one was talking about third-party cookies. Okay. Interestingly, what people are talking about now is the extent to which you're allowed to use first-party data in your marketing. So it's almost like GDPR is also coming back to bite really now.
Yeah.
Right? So if someone has opted out of marketing, you're obviously not allowed to market to them. But a lot of businesses are still using sort of legitimate interest or implied interest as the reason to market to their current customers, to use their first-party data, their sales data. And what was really interesting was a point that HSBC made, which their understanding or their legal understanding is that that's not that isn't okay, or isn't definitely okay. So they're obviously worried about that, and that means you have a much smaller set of data to work with, right?
Yeah.
If you can't target your own customers. Now, the solutions to these sort of cookie problems, I would say, boil down into like 3 broad categories. The solutions, that were discussed a lot at Performance Marketing World. So, at the sort of most cookie-like, let's start with most cookie-like. You had something called server-side tracking.
Yeah.
Which is basically generating cookies, but instead of generating them in the browser, so instead of first-party cookies being generated in the browser when the user clicks on something, you're detecting that event back at your website where your website's stored, right, on the server.
Yeah, backdoor cookies. Yeah,
so they're kind of backdoor cookies. The difference is like the infrastructure to associate that cookie back to a customer is much more difficult, much more complicated. You basically have to have like a specialist service to do that, and it's a very expensive service to set up, right? If you want to know what someone in your CRM has done on your website using server-side, there's quite a lot of infrastructure and processing that goes on in that gap, and thus it is quite expensive. And therefore it's not really accessible for a lot of businesses. Now, a version of that is conversion APIs.
Okay.
So these are provided by Facebook or Google. So Facebook's is called Conversion API. Google's is called, I think it's the Google Ads API /conversion. Yeah. So people have started just calling it Conversion API, or CAPI for short, because marketers love acronyms. And what the Conversion API does is it tracks traffic on your website and then gives that, instead of back to you, it gives it directly to Google or Facebook. So it's kind of like you can kind of think of it as like a short-lived cookie, but on the server side again, that can enhance your ad campaigns, but doesn't give the information back to you. And the way you support Conversion APIs, you put your first-party data into that. So you might connect it to your customer management systems, your customer data systems. So you give your data to Facebook or Google, and what Facebook and Google do is use that to make your ads better, right? To target your ads, because they understand more about what people who click their ads then go to do on your site and how many of them become customers and things like that. Now, taking that idea of giving your data to someone else and then them doing something with it one step further, we have data clean rooms, which came up quite a few times. Mm-hmm. So a data clean room is taking that idea of you give your first party data to someone, and then they give you some information back based on that. And what the beauty or the kind of the idea of the data clean room is, instead of giving your data to a third party who does some analysis on it, you give your data to a clean room. Other first party data, for example, like experience data, comes into the clean room. It gets matched inside the algorithm, and then you can do a segmentation, for example, and the results come out. So you get the results of the segmentation, but you've never seen any other first party data. Your first party data has not actually gone to anyone else. Okay. It's like this grey matching happens, but no, it's not possible to kind of pick apart and get back your customer data from it. So you can get more general targeting information out of that rather than just for Google or just for Facebook. But you can't get sort of the customer matching stuff that we used to be able to do.
Bit like a data cocktail shaker.
Yes.
One of the ingredients is your own data. There's loads of other ingredients that you're not sure about, and you just get a nice drink out at the end, but you couldn't reverse engineer it.
Exactly, yeah. So it prevents anyone reverse engineering what any of your customers are doing, for example.
Interesting. Okay. Nice. Okay.
And when it comes to e-commerce with those solutions, I mean, everyone in e-commerce is probably jumping towards Conversion API as a solution because that's the platforms they play in a lot.
Yeah.
And they are also the cheapest and easiest to use in theory. Yeah. In practice, the getting your customer data in is by all accounts not that simple. And in fact, HSBC implied that they, despite being the first in the UK to start working with Facebook, they are not yet integrated fully with all the customer data that they want to get in. Now, they're a company that has very complex customer data structures and lifetimes, and we can imagine it's to do with all of that sort of thing. Like, they sell multiple products, they're products that people turn on and off. They have a complex customer data structure, and it might be that an e-commerce firm does not have that complex customer data structure, and it's much easier to integrate. And it wouldn't surprise me if, given their general the market for their marketing, Facebook and Meta have targeted e-commerce companies, right? A lot of their marketing is that shopping side of things. So I imagine it's a lot easier for those people. So I wouldn't take that as too much of a warning. But that's definitely the easiest thing, I think, for e-commerce companies to try.
What's the that's great. It's more accessible, and I get that. Are there any downsides, or what's exposed that they had access to? What do they lose, I guess, by doing that?
So what you've lost in doing all of these things is the ability to do as much with your data, and the ability to own as much of that data, right? And to do innovative new things yourselves with it. So in particular, conversion APIs, a very obvious answer, way that this happens is what Facebook works out is good for you. You can only then apply in Facebook. They won't tell you what they've worked out, right? If Facebook works out that people who have an interest in a particular sport are really good customers for you, you're not sport related, not sport related clothing brand, you don't get that information back. So you can't use it in your other marketing channels. And it very much keeps you inside these walled gardens.
Yeah, which, coming back to the point you mentioned in the beginning in terms of people struggling to measure campaigns across channel, it makes that job even harder, right? It's one thing if you've got comparative measurements, but if you're not even sure what they're going after, even if you can compare if they're working, you don't know why they're working, which
yes.
I think, therefore to replicate, great, this one works better, let's do what that one's doing over here. It's like, well, what was that one doing? I don't know. So it doesn't help even if you can understand necessarily.
Yeah, and it's very much, I think that a trap that people can fall into is they end up with a marketing mix which is being dictated by the marketing tool providers, not what's best for their company, because
that's a great point.
Yeah, Facebook or because Meta or Google keep all the information in, and they're like, well, you can spend your money efficiently with us, and you can't take that out. You can't take that information out.
And then it comes almost self-fulfilling, because there might be better areas out there, but if the platforms are directing where you're spending, as in they say put more in here and they can make it look good, it might be good, but there might be a 10x opportunity over here somewhere that you're just, because you're not making that decision of that mix proactively, you're, I guess, limiting the potential for the potential returns that you could actually be generating.
Exactly. And also as these tools pull in, okay, if you imagine the way that Google's algorithm works, right, it competes against itself. So it pulls in data from your trainer brand and tries to sell your trainers. It's actually trying to sell trainers for 20 other trainer brands at the same time, right? And what was really interesting, there was a provider there who has like a kind of like a machine learning thing that sort of sits inside Google and does keyword search in Google, and they specifically only work with one company from each niche, right? They won't work from two companies with the same niche, because the AI will not work properly because it'll be competing against itself.
Yeah. Wow, that seems quite. They've got a limit there. There's not that many niches in terms of customers, but hey, hopefully we won't dive into that. Okay, great. I think that's a really good overview. Good deep dive into the cookie conversation, and some things they can take away. So I think next you were talking about attribution and measurement, and I love this conversation because it won't surprise you that I have this conversation daily, and for me, it's always a big swing between business metrics, how much are we spending and how much value, how much bottom line are we generating for the business, versus the continual tension with performance metrics. Sometimes the performance metrics might tell one story, but the revenue tells another story. And even if the revenue story is better, often the performance metrics still win out, which is an interesting conversation. So really interested to see what that conversation looked like yesterday, and how can we, I don't think we're going to close the door on attribution today, but how can we help people feel a bit more comfortable with attribution, and I guess maybe is comfortable the right word, is maybe the question, do people have to feel more uncomfortable with attribution? Do we need to be more uncomfortable, more comfortable with being uncomfortable? We're not going to know the answers, and I don't know. So it'd be interesting to hear what was talked about.
So I think there's a few things to kind of pull apart here, and I think it was summarized in one. There was one talk by, I think his name was Frankie Athill, who did a very interesting talk, kind of based around the results of a survey he had conducted and these are scale up e-commerce CMOs, and the results of the survey are basically that I think it was over 70% of people of CMOs are unhappy with how they're doing their attribution, or their understanding the effects of each of their channels. And what's interesting is anyone who had a specific tool, people with specific tools to try and do that, were less happy with the solution than people who didn't have specific tools to do that, which I think tells you all you need to know about how well it's really going, right?
Wow.
And how nervous marketers in general are. So I think that's the first message that came out was like, if you're nervous about your attribution, don't worry, everyone else is too.
Okay. So just on that, for me, 70% of people being unhappy with attribution is a massive number. And you're saying more people are unhappy if they're actually paying for a tool.
Yes.
What did he give that number?
He did, but I'm afraid I don't have it in my notes. We can put it in the show notes because I will have. Okay. I will be able to get it out.
That's crazy. So it's probably, let's say it's at least 80% then, or it's at least 75%. So that's crazy if you're paying for attribution software.
And unhappy with the way it does it. I mean, those people are facing up to the question. So the particular question that's being faced up to here is how do, as a CMO, how do you decide which channels get your money, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, and the reason that's kind of the level, I think that's the level where the most uncertainty sat. That was definitely the summary that came from a lot of the speakers. So if you go lower than that, so you ask, okay, what's going on inside channels, or inside platforms, then people are a little bit happier. That's not to say that they should be, right? Because they're not answering the ultimate question. They're not able to do their comparative analysis, right? And here, I think it's important to pull apart two different factors, really. And that's the difference between attribution and sort of what you might call incrementality or effect, right? Mm-hmm. So attribution being, okay, how many sales did this generate? Mm-hmm. Judging using this model, a particular model, versus incrementality, which is I actually, by spending X amount of pounds, how much did that generate in revenue?
Yeah.
And they are actually, very different questions. And what tends to be the case, and is the case, is that when you go from inside channel to outside, when you go from one platform to across platforms, that's when you have to stop asking the what sales did it generate by a model question.
Yeah.
And start asking about money and money it generated in general. And the reason for that is that the inside a platform, the models that attribute sales are relatively stable.
Yeah.
And there is like some sort of analysis that you can use. And in particular, something that a lot of people did talk about was data-driven attribution, which is like a Google model which does sort of cross-channel attribution, actually. And it is better than nothing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't ultimately answer the question, what if I spent less or spent more on that channel?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting that when you've spoken there, I always pull it back to Byron Sharp. I think we might have spoke about him last time. Either way, he's a marketing scientist, and he talks about the benefit of ads are there to renew memory structures. So really that they benefit that somebody already knows about your product, and an ad is there to renew that memory structure to keep them going. And when it comes to understanding the right channels, I think it's often hard to understand which. I don't know what I totally butchered that, so we might have to just cut that out, Harry. Sorry, buddy. There's a thought in my head that just, as I started going down it, I'm like, no, that doesn't work. Let me find a jump off point to what you were just saying. It's really interesting the way when you kind of mentioned there, right at the top of that is about CMOs understanding which channels. I know we've talked about it before, and to be fair, it's linked to the previous part of the conversation, actually. But I think sometimes it's kind of the platforms dictating the budget that should where it should go, rather than them understanding, well, look, this is what my audience looks like, this is where they hang out, and in this area this channel might be more appropriate, and over here it might be this channel, and here it's this channel, and therefore the appropriate amount of spend in each one is, we should probably spend this much, we'll allocate this to TikTok, this to Google, and this to Facebook, and then you go through the platform based metrics which keep you spending on those platforms or not, as opposed to that sort of where are our customers and what do our customers look like first. And I think in this this new world, we've got so many digital channels. Geodems necessarily don't give us necessarily that much depth in terms of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. Like, it's always worth understanding that like the channel's job or the platform's job is to get you to spend more money on the platform, right?
Yeah.
And for that reason, they will, Performance Max, great example of this. Like, Google's Performance Max is, you give it some money and it does the optimization, because the general opinion at Google, and it does look like the feedback, we've discussed it before and the feedback was quite mixed, but now it seems like generally people are finding Performance Max is improving their results. And when you think about it, that really what Google is sort of saying there is we gave you a tool, you weren't good enough at using it.
Yeah.
So we're going to tell you how to use it.
Yeah.
And the trade-off is that then you're going to be able to put more money into it because you're getting more sales per pound of advert, right? More ROAS. The point is that you can't really then compare that performance across system.
Yeah.
It's very hard to compare that to how your meta performance is, because the metrics and the data doesn't get shared, and then B, like, the realistic customer journeys are actually touch both points, right? And so they've kind of got to share the attribution or the incrementality, share the effect.
Yeah.
And what none of these systems really account for is if you hadn't spent that pound on Facebook or Meta, what would that have done to your Google results?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you need much more complex models for. So this is where mixed models come in, that like lots of people have spoken about, and then also experiments, right? So using lift experiments to say like, okay, let's spend no money on Google, and then see in some places or some areas, or let's spend extra money on Google in some areas of the country and not others.
What's the lift experiment? Sorry.
So sorry, yeah, a lift experiment. I'll explain it. So lift experiments, they come in two forms based around the same idea, right? The simple idea is you find some places in the country or in a region where you say increase or decrease your ad spend.
Yeah.
Or you do something differently, and then other places where you leave it the same, and then you compare the results of those two processes in those two places. So let's say, okay, we're going to send double our ad spend in some of our areas,
mm-hmm.
and then ask how many more sales does that lead to? Okay. And that tells you what the value of doubling your ad spend was. Now, inside both Facebook and Google, you can do this automatically for Facebook and Google ads.
Yeah.
What you can't do is say, okay, actually, what if I move £10 from Facebook to Google?
Yeah.
With that, what is the effect of that? And then you have to be able to do the experiments yourselves. Now, marketers do get kind of nervous about this sort of thing, right? Because it's this sort of test and learn, but it's definitely the effect that everyone wants to be doing it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They're just slightly nervous of the implications.
Yeah.
And I think that's what drags people back to in-channel metrics a lot.
Yeah.
Especially people who have view of the whole stack. So people in smaller companies where they're deciding, when the same person is deciding how much do you spend on Facebook and how much do you spend on Google, and once it's on Facebook, where do you spend it?
Mm-hmm.
In those companies, people get dragged down towards the performance metrics, the attribution metrics, because they get updated daily. Yeah. Whereas you might be able to conduct an experiment every couple of months, and then to go one step further, like people talk about media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling, which is like a big project, includes lots of data, it's expensive to do, and you might do it at most once every 6 months.
Yeah.
And that's the way to get the best impression of the impact your marketing is having, but you're just limited by time and budget. You can't do that all the time.
Yeah.
And therefore you can't act on it all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that I get that, and you see why people go back to the metrics. But then on the flip side, and this is a trend that we see quite a lot with our customers, in the Herdify, is that the attributed sales in the platform are kind of well off when you simply analyze sales in those areas. So what we're really talking about here is direct and indirect effects. Indirect are being these word of mouth influence, whatever's happening here. But we had a customer the other day, and in kind of the hotspots where word of mouth activity was high, I think the platform was missing nearly 80%. Okay, so the performance metrics didn't look great, but you could see a solid trend that the ads were doing a great job at causing ripples. I like to visualize throwing a stone into the lake, and it's these ripples that carry on long after the ad has landed, which meant the platform metrics were just well off. It's not to say they should stop spending, but it kind of brings in this one-to-many relationship, I think, which people don't consider with ads. I think ads are typically seen as a one-to-one. I serve one ad impression, I hopefully get a response from that, and that's how we work out the success. Whereas the platforms miss this one-to-many, where one ad causes a cascade or a ripple that causes 5, 6, 7, 8 activities to happen because it's being propped up. And I think it's going to be really interesting that as we get more and more complex with the digital landscape, there are social platforms you say that are not yet using advertising. Let's keep looking forward. There's going to be many more social platforms that come out. So where we can spend our ad pounds is going to be even higher in terms of variety. Pulling that back into a story, it's just going to get harder. Which brings me back to this: we always need to understand it. But I wonder whether we've also got to get slightly more comfortable with not being able to tell the full picture, and sort of basing our earlier decisions on something a bit more grounded.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the sort of like the way things are going, right? As you say, like I think a good question people can ask themselves is what fraction of all of their sales are attributed anywhere? And particularly if you're an e-commerce brand that's only really doing online ads and digital ads, then ask yourself, once you've taken away all the sales, like for some of our customers, you take away all their attributed sales, and they might be left with the conclusion that 90% of their sales are organic, right? Mm-hmm. Now, ask yourself, is that realistic? That and what that means is that realistic? If you turned off all of your digital channels, would you expect to lose only 10% of your sales? And and if you do agree with that, then how much are you spending on marketing, and do you expect better returns from it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. The other thing to mention with extra social channels coming in here is something that wasn't one of my top 3, but also something that was mentioned quite a lot is retail marketplaces, right? Very much feel like they really exploded last year. Mm-hmm. So for anyone that isn't aware, a retail marketplace is where your brand and you can sell products through another website, right? The most prominent of these is Amazon.
Yeah.
But now,
like Boots, for example, if I sell healthcare products, I can actually advertise on the Boots website close to my target customer, so they see Tom's vitamins as opposed to somebody else's.
Exactly, and what Boots, Tesco's, and to a greater extent now Amazon have worked out in the last year, or definitely revealed to the world that they've worked out in the last year, is that the margin on those sites is in the advertising on site. So banner ads on Amazon is an example, but also search rankings and things like that.
Yeah.
And as a marketer, what that means is that's another channel you've got to pay for, it's another channel you've got to manage, and it's another channel you've got to optimize for. Mm-hmm. And rather than giving you a job, it then becomes a question of, okay, is it worth spending as much time in those channels as you do on Google? And that's only an answer you can really answer yourself, but like in terms of measurement, it means you really have to have a view of these wider things, right, out of channel attribution, because otherwise so much of your money is going to be split up that you need to decide, you need to be able to have a decision-making process which says, okay, there's a new RTM, retail network available, do we use it? So you think about trying to answer that, and some people might think that's a business decision, but that's really a marketing decision a lot of the time. You know, can we actually get sales out of it which have value?
Yeah. Okay. Right, that's a good deep dive on attribution. Let's go for one more. Let's jump into, I think you were saying brands starting to move their brand activity into the sort of traditional performance channels. What are traditionally seen as performance channels?
Yeah, so I think this was really interesting. It actually brings together kind of what we were just talking about, right? Like when you have all these different performance marketing touch points, actually that becomes a bigger and bigger share of your overall amount of marketing, right? Yeah. And it becomes more clear to people that digital has a role in brand building, or performance has a role in brand building. So there are a couple of interesting sort of tidbits of information that were dropped in here. So HSBC were saying that they have merged, I think this was their personal banking marketing, they have merged brand and performance teams and budget into a single budget for the year, this year for the first time, and partly that's come with a big budget cut. That was one of the reasons for it, but also as a result of this, they're running their first kind of like digital brand and performance related campaign. So it's mainly executed by performance, but it has brand and ambitions. And what that means for them is that the metrics it's judged on are long-term brand sales and brand building metrics, as opposed to those performance metrics. They don't really care about them. An interesting kind of related thing was Apple, at least used to run brand campaigns, but through their performance channels. So it would be the brand team dictating the campaign, and the goal of the campaign would only be to get to the top of a certain keyword, right? And that wasn't because they thought that getting to the top meant they got more sales on that keyword. Yeah. It was to get to the top, increase their brand relationship with that keyword.
Right, interesting.
And I think this is really kind of interesting as like an idea that we need to be thinking more broadly about, okay, what is the goal of your digital ads? And it talks to this attribution piece like, okay, it's not just about getting someone to click on it, get them on site, and then convert them, right? It's about that journey.
And that goes back to the Byron Sharp stuff that we've talked about before, that it's about renewing memory structures. And I've often thought, coming from outside the industry, that that using performance just as a harvesting tool is great if you're a global brand, right? And it's literally when am I trying to buy people so many people who've got intent and know about it. But if you're not well known everywhere, we're just trying to keep memory structures alive. And I think back to sort of influencers, where I've watched YouTube videos of people who I think I know and watch, and they recommend a product, and I've clicked so many of their links and gone, that's a cool product, I want to buy that one day. I couldn't tell you any of those products right now because I've forgotten them, right? And so the influencer's done his job, they've got me to click the website, but then I needed to keep seeing or hearing about that, which brings together this. It's not just about conversion. I wasn't ready to buy. There's some brand building there that needed doing.
So I think that's actually one of the most active spaces in this, is the influencer as a arm of performance marketing. Like the idea of long-term brand relationships with influencers, and that's about building brand as much, using the influencer's brand to amend to the product's brand, as much as it's about knowing that using that kind of a long-term relationship it does drive kind of short-term results as well, right? So that, but there's lots there about like, building kind of influencers almost as like retailers, right? You're kind of looking at their digital space and using that as a space to place your product. Now, that kind of leads into a point that was made a few times, which is that younger generations spend so much of their time on digital that your brand is defined by its digital ads, because they are the adverts that you see they are the adverts that younger people, your under 25s are seeing. They don't see your non-digital ads as much, or as a fraction of all the ads they see. Now, an interesting part of that is that really then what we're really talking about is that we're saying that digital or performance ads are ads you can measure the impact of.
Yeah.
And really, it's kind of ironic that we've got to the point where like that's not the point of them. Not all digital ads need to be measured straight away as a performance ad.
Yeah, I think there's a really good point there in terms of, if I was working full time, day to day as a performance marketer, in the climate we're in, it's tough because ad costs or acquisition costs are going up, and there's less people buying with the current kind of climate. But if you can reposition your role in that, yes, we absolutely have got performance element to it, but also it's about some of these longer term metrics and some of these ripple metrics, to coin the phrase that I talked about earlier. It can help you sort of paint a picture to your leadership team that your ads are actually working a lot harder. If you look at some of these other metrics with a longer term lens, your ads are actually working a lot harder than the short term performance metrics show. So it's not about spending less on ads, but it's about trying to paint a bigger picture and maybe taking a bit more credit for the work the performance team are doing in some of these other areas. Even if it's not a company strategy to say we're going to do brand building with performance, it's already going to be working in it. So we've got brands moving that way, and as a performance marketer, helping your company move that way just gets you more recognition, I think, for the work that you're already doing within the business.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's actually been a false equivalent or a false wall or separation being constructed over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years since the internet came around, where when the internet was text-based, then it made more sense to talk about performance marketing on the internet as it's a conversion tool, right? We're trying to get the people on the internet to our site. Now, the internet's moved on a long time since then. It's now broadly video-based, and that doesn't allow... And we've kind of stuck with those metrics, right? Another way of looking at this is if you could put a camera or something on top of a billboard and then track everyone who looked at it, would you then judge the performance of billboard campaigns by the number of people who then bought the product in the next 7 days?
Yeah.
The answer is all brand marketers say no, it's long-term marketing, right?
Yeah.
And the same is true online. It's almost like because we can measure it in the short term, we focus on the short term.
Yeah.
And we assume that the thing that's good in the short term is good in the long term, which is definitely not necessarily the right conclusion to make. Yeah.
Okay. That's a good place to start to wrap it up, I think there's three things: cookies, attribution, and that kind of shift towards brand with some of the typical performance channels. And I think 3 takeaways for me are, I think, the fact that this conversion API, theme, be that through Meta or be that through Google or the other channels, is a good way for sort of e-commerce businesses to start getting on board with this and get ahead of some of the cookie problems. Attribution and measurement, I think the big takeaway there is most people are unhappy with it. I think, it's if you're looking in your business and you're worrying about it, so are most other people. That's not to say it's not to try and fix it, but I think also what we've talked about there's a lot of indirect effects that you're not going to be able to measure, even with the most complex models. So, there are better ways to look at it, but I think it's an interesting area that we're going to see more development on. And then the final one is I think really what I said there around performance marketers in these businesses, that you're already doing a lot of work that's contributing towards brand, and I think there's more targeting that can be done around that. But actually, the work you're doing there and trying to find some non-performance metrics to demonstrate to the business the value you're already doing, be that from these indirect sales that are not being attributed through the platform because of a longer-term lens, or other kind of brand metrics. I think there's a lot that you can kind of demonstrate to the business, which will help you hopefully help leadership build a more cohesive strategy, right? And rather than the platforms dictating it, you can show that they're having different impacts than you may have originally thought. They're my takeaways. Any for you?
No, I think that's kind of a very good summary of the conference you weren't at. So which means this discussion's gone well in terms of passing on the information. I think for me, the summary was that the performance marketers need to or can think bigger in terms of their role. It's also worth saying, we're getting to the stage where a lot of CMOs came up through the performance world, and that's definitely helping, I think, the process. And so for performance marketers or digital marketers, they, as individuals, can think about, all these, think about how to measure really and help them use data to answer the questions that they actually face in their job, and demonstrate the true benefits, right, of their campaigns, because I do think they are undervalued at the moment. And I think for e-commerce in particular, the goal there is to understand, where are your sales coming from and how do you get more of them? And you can only really understand that once you understand the ripple effects, as you say, of your advertising.
Great. Well, let's bring it to an end. All I will do is, because just we haven't got a guest, I think we should still do our recommendations as we do every week. I am going to go first just because I'm feeling selfish and I've got a good one. A bit left field, but it's a coffee manufacturer called Redbur, Redbur, and they are a coffee wholesaler in Surrey. Now, the reason I like these guys is because they typically, I believe, they sell to more trade. So they sell in volume, therefore their prices are good. But also the quality of the coffee is excellent. So I've recently been drinking a coffee matured in rum barrels. So, which, to honestly, it's a bit weird at first because there's a bit of a trend out there to age stuff in barrels of whiskey and rum, and most of them I don't ever taste anything. But this, you can taste the rum. Now, there's obviously no alcohol in there, but it's a bit weird when you have a coffee at 6 o'clock in the morning and there's aftertastes of rum. You're like, I'm not sure I want to be tasting rum at 6 o'clock in the morning. But nonetheless, check them out. They're great. You can buy it in whatever quantity, and so I think pricing is really good for good quality coffee. So yeah, enjoy. Ed, got any recommendations this week?
Well, I think it's only fair to recommend Performance Marketing World Unlocked, which I did think was a very interesting conference, and they've already announced the dates for next year. It's similar time, early March next year. So yeah, wow. If you're into performance marketing world, if you're in performance marketing, it's definitely something to have a look at.
I think from what we've said, even if you're in brand marketing, you should maybe start having a look as well. I should add, the number of conversations that me and you have about how many poor events there are out there, the fact that this has made it as a recommendation is means a lot, means even more. So great stuff. Well, Ed, thank you for taking me through that. I'm glad I got the condensed version. So hopefully our listeners can take away some useful things. We'd love to know from you, if you disagree with anything that was talked about in performance marketing world, is it right that brand moves on it moves into part of the performance channels or not. Are you actually really happy with attribution? If you're one of those 30%, it'd be great to understand why. Drop us a line. On the usual social channels, you can find us, or if you want to email us, we're herdify.com. So hello at, or we've got the website www.herdify.com. Hopefully hear from you, but if not, we will see you again for 2 weeks for another episode where we've got a very exciting guest. We'll leave the suspense there until next time. So until then, take care and see you soon.